Hello, 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 everyone. I'm going to say hello to Jill. Hello, Jill.
Hi, Brett. How are you?
I'm good. We didn't have as much of a chance as usual to catch up right before, so this is kind of nice.
Yeah, well, it's different times. We have to work with what we got.
There's a lesson in just being present and and
Flexible.
flexible and at peace with our emotions. Um, so now I want to welcome everyone else who is joining us. This is Ask Dr. Jill. I want to introduce American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's Vice President of Research, the star of our show, Dr. Jill Harkavy-Friedman. Hello, Jill.
Hi, everyone, and hi, Mr. Brett Ween. How are you?
I'm good. And I'm the Director of Writing and Entertainment Outreach at AFSP, and I love these conversations. And we've gotten a lot of questions for this one, and I think there are people watching, and so I'm excited to get started. And I thought I'd just start off by mentioning that it's May 25th, and so we are right at the tail end of Mental Health Awareness Month. And AFSP's campaign for Mental Health Awareness Month, More for Mental Health, hashtag More for Mental Health, is about advocating for the legislation and policies that we know through research save lives. It's about demanding more for mental health. And one of the core demands is, and this is how it's going to come to play in our discussion today, more research that will help us learn more and support people better. So that's what we're talking about today. What we've learned about suicide from suicide prevention research. And I'll just throw in a quick plug that if you're interested in finding out about those other More for Mental Health demands and how you can get involved and make a difference, there's a special website we've created for this month, and it's just moreformentalhealth.org. But let's get into it. We want to hear your questions. We've already gotten some. But I thought to start things off, before we get into these really great questions we've already gotten, and if you have some as you're watching right now, just type them in. Jill, I thought I'd ask you, what are some of if you could quickly maybe talk about some things that, a lot of people don't even realize there is research into suicide prevention. And what are some of the, I think, most important things that we've learned through the research?
Well, first of all, I just want to say hi to everyone, and I'm so excited to be talking about research, because research is fundamental to whatever we have learned. And research, it doesn't necessarily produce facts, but it produces information. And the more we study something, the more information we get, and the more we understand it. So when I first got into this field, I don't know, 35 plus years ago, we really didn't know much at all. We knew that people die by suicide. The mistake was made that there was nothing you could do about it. And in fact, there wasn't even understanding that the brain was involved in suicide. There were all kinds of misconceptions. Like, it turns out, if you talk to someone about if they're thinking about suicide, you're not going to make them suicidal. That's not how suicide works. But in fact, you could help them. So there used to be the mistaken belief that if you asked someone, you were going to make them suicidal. But it turns out that suicide is very complex. And so the big picture that we've learned is that there are many factors that may lead a person to be more vulnerable or at risk for suicide. And then in the context or when they face stressors, that risk may declare itself. That risk may come out. It may not. You could have a risk for suicide and you may never even think about it. But if you have these factors, and so these factors might include having a mental health condition, having a head injury, having substance use, having a chronic health condition or chronic pain, family history of suicide. There's a history of trauma or abuse. So there's a number of factors, and one person might have several factors. And then when they experience stress, they may be at increased risk for suicide, at least briefly. And we want to keep away access to lethal means because, of course, fortunately, if you don't have access to lethal means, one cannot kill themselves. And the other thing we've learned is that if you keep someone from taking their life in the moment, that moment may pass and they may never even think about it again. If you limit access to lethal means, at least they will survive long enough to feel better. So I just actually told you a few things that we've learned about suicide. One, it's complex. There's no single cause of suicide. Two, mental health plays a role, but it is not the whole story. There are lots of people who have mental health conditions who are not at risk for suicide, that limiting access to lethal means could help someone through a crisis moment. And I'm going to add the other thing we learned, which is that the brain, this should not be a surprise, is involved in suicide, both suicidal behavior and suicide prevention. And what happens, what we've learned is that people who are at risk for suicide tend to be thinking about things differently. And when they're in a crisis, they don't have access to their usual coping. And by the way, that's part of why lethal means counseling works, because if you take away the means, they're not thinking flexibly enough to pick something else out. But if they do, it won't be as lethal. So the way a person thinks, now there are many different ways to get to suicide. For some people, they feel that they only look at the short-term rewards of things. They don't look at what could happen down the road. They're like, this is how I feel terrible, I'm in pain, I want the pain to stop. And they can't see beyond that pain. Some people have other kinds of brain issues that are related to the ability to control their impulse, relate to mood, and to their thinking. So it's quite complex. Okay, I could go on forever about what we've learned from research. I think we should get a little more specific.
Yeah, I wanted to just unpack one thing that you mentioned, because I think it's important for people to understand. It's about giving people time. It's about temporarily removing access to means. I think a lot of people have this misconception that I think is really reasonable to have, that, oh, well, if someone doesn't have access to their preferred means in the moment that they're thinking of taking their life, they think that, oh, well, that person will just find another way. But the research shows, and tell me if I'm getting this right, Jill, from the layperson perspective, what it means is that the actual moment of possible action is a very particular sort of mental state. And typically, not, we don't know that always, but most of the time, that really, really painful state of possible action lasts for a certain number of minutes. And not to take away how painful it is, but it really is a matter of buying the person time for a certain number of minutes. And that's why most of the time they won't go on to take their life.
Yeah, so it could be minutes to hours for some people. But that's why we have like the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255, which is going to 988 soon, and also the crisis text line. And we can talk about how that works. But if that moment passes, so there's like often, not always, some people think about it. Their thinking is different, though. They're still thinking that nothing will ever get better. They're still feeling hopeless. They're still having trouble accessing alternate ways of managing and problem solving. It's just that in a crisis, for some people, that'll come and go relatively quickly. So something like limiting access to lethal means gives, first of all, time for somebody to intervene, but also time for the crisis to slow down and to reduce. And I want to say something that we've learned from research that's really important, which is that lots of people think about suicide, and that is often a sign of distress, but people think about it for all different kinds of reasons. Fewer people actually will make a suicide attempt, and fewer will die by suicide. And the trick is that just because someone's thinking about it doesn't mean they're at risk in the moment of dying by suicide. And in fact, 90% of people who do make a suicide attempt do not end up dying by suicide. It's one of the complicated things about suicide, which is that these three groups, and they're not really groups, they overlap, but there are differences between them about what what leads someone to actually engage in suicidal behavior. And the reason I'm making this point is when someone is thinking about killing themselves, the most important thing that any of us can do is have a conversation with them to find out what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and what their intention is. We don't have to have a knee-jerk response. Somebody says, I wish I wasn't here anymore, or I wish I were dead, or I'm going to kill myself. That's a sign of pain. That's a sign that if you're with them or you know them, ask them further questions. What do they mean by that? What's making them feel that way? Do they think they're going to act on it? Because we've learned through research that just because somebody's thinking about suicide does not mean they are at risk for acting on it. Now, they may act on it down the road, or they may act on it immediately, but that's why we have to have a conversation. We have to learn about who they are, gather their history, talk about what's going on in their lives right now. Everybody doesn't have to suddenly become a therapist. That's the kind of conversation we actually, Brett has done a great job of developing guides to how to have a real conversation. And so it's just having a basic conversation where rather than panicking, you really get to understand what the person's feeling so that you can direct them to help. Many people may benefit from brief therapy. Some people may need longer term therapy. Some people need to connect with a crisis line right away. Some people need crisis intervention. Some people need to go to the emergency department. But the critical thing is have a conversation with them and find out where they are at and what they are thinking. And while we can't prevent every suicide, we can do our best to try and intervene when possible.
That's great. And yeah, maybe we can link to those real convo guides for anyone who's interested. But let's get to the question. These are some very specific questions. So let's get into it. One person writes in, you mentioned head injuries, Jill. One person writes in, is suicide related to head injuries, specifically concussions?
So, head injury and even concussion are very diverse terms, but there is research that shows that even people who have minor traumatic brain injuries, that the rate of suicide in the group of people who've had that is a little complicated. It's not that everybody who has a head injury is at risk for suicide, but when you look at a group of people who've engaged in suicidal behavior or have actually died by suicide, the rate of head injury is higher. About 40% of people who made an attempt, for instance, had a history of a head injury. Of course, that means 60% did not. And we don't know how many people who have had head injuries who've never even thought about suicide. And I have to say, that's the way it is with most things in suicide when we're trying to understand risk factors. Lots of people may have any one risk factor. And so we can't say they had a head trauma, so they're going to have a suicide risk. No, it doesn't work that way. It's more if you have that, plus you have other factors like a chronic illness, a mental health condition, and pain, and difficulty dealing with stress, that constellation of factors could increase your risk.
Right, because it's usually more than one risk factor happening.
Always.
No one takes their life for a single reason. It's usually like kind of a perfect storm of 2 or 3 different things.
Right. Well, those are the things that actually could increase your risk. And then there are the things that happen in the moment, like stressors, like alcohol or drugs, particularly alcohol, like being in a major depressive episode. Those are more in the moment kinds of things that for someone who is at risk, having those circumstances could increase their risk so that they act. It's kind of like this, like we all have a threshold. It's actually interesting because it turns out we all have an optimism, pessimism threshold too. Like we all.
What does that mean?
Like we all have a way that we usually are. Like I tend to be, well, I call it pragmatically optimistic, but everybody knows that I can find a silver lining in almost anything, understanding the bad things too. I'm not ignoring them. So that's the pragmatic part.
Right.
But some people have more pessimism. So when and that's probably related to brain function, genetics, and all these things. So when something happens, they experience it differently and may be more impacted by the trauma. So research has shown that some people tend to be more pessimistic than other people. That's not really a surprise. I'm sure all of us could name somebody who has more pessimism and somebody who's very optimistic. This is not carved in stone. It can change. Our brains are very flexible. We actually, when we engage in therapy, we might actually help to improve our brain function, even regardless of how old you are. So there's always a reason for hope. And that's the other part of suicide prevention, that no matter how terrible you feel, there's a reason for hope.
I didn't mean to cut you off, but how do we know that? Because I want to also get during this discussion into how is research conducted. I imagine sometimes you alluded to statistics, and it's just looking really carefully in certain ways at statistics, but are suicide prevention researchers also studying like brain waves or things like that?
Everything. So even in our research grants program, some of our studies are looking at genetics, and which we all know about now, epigenetics, like mRNA, how genes function. People look at the brains in different ways. So one way we look at the brain is by asking people questions about what they're thinking and feeling, and inferring or from that trying to understand about brain and behavior. We can do imaging studies where we actually take images of the brain, and often at a stable place, not doing anything, which we call fixation, and then also doing an activity and looking at the change in brain behavior during different kinds of activities that stimulate different parts of the brain. Now, some people also look at the brains of people who died by suicide once they've died. And this is, a lot of people don't realize that the brain is an organ that you can donate, just like any other organ. It won't give a life to a person directly, but what we learn from that brain will likely help people down the road. Same way if you have brain cancer, donating your brain helps people to learn. So people actually look at the brains of people who died by suicide and look at the cells in the brain, look at the genetics in the brain. So yes, we look at it at every level. We talk to people who've never thought about suicide, people who've thought about it but never made an attempt, people who've attempted suicide once or multiple times, and then families of people who've lost someone to suicide. And in fact, we have national resources like the National Violent Death Reporting System, which gathers data about the person who died by suicide and the circumstances around that death. And at AFSP, we advocated for years to get the National Violent Death Reporting System in all 50 states. And now it's in all 50 states plus Puerto Rico. And so now our advocacy is going to be going towards making it even better. This is the relationship between advocacy and research. As we learn things, we've learned that crisis set lines and crisis contacts can help reduce risk of suicide, in part by de-escalating the problem, in part by offering, together doing some problem solving, and also by connecting people to care. That came out of research. Before there was the idea, well, crisis lines won't work because they're in a crisis, but it turns out they do work. And so we use that to advocate for a 3-digit number for suicide prevention. It's going to take some time for 988 to reach all states, but we're going to get there. And we're going to train our workers up. So we use research every day. I mean, if you think about it, right? How many of you carried an umbrella today, and why? What did you base that on? How many brushed their teeth with fluoride? That's research. Did you wear a parka or winter coat or a light jacket? Well, that means you weighed the data to make a decision about your life. So we're actually all using research all the time and making decisions.
That's such a great point. And we have so many great questions coming in. I want to try and get to as many as we can. So here's something. We're talking about statistics. Are there statistics on once a family member dies by suicide, that the chances of another family member will do the same?
So this is the suicide, the way we understand suicide. Having a family history of suicide can increase your risk, just like having a family history of breast cancer can increase your risk, or heart disease. So what that means is, just like heart disease or breast cancer, if you have that risk, you want to monitor it closely. So you want to take care of your mental health and your problem solving, your thinking. And then if you notice something happening, like let's say you're getting depressed or starting to think about substances, to actually act and intervene early. Early intervention makes a big difference. So we know that some parts of suicide are genetic, as well as runs in families. Those are not 100% the same. For instance, really interesting, a couple of the genes that were found to be different in people who die by suicide had to do with how stress is processed. And think about it. You know, some people are very reactive to stress. Other people, nothing moves them. Well, it turns out there are genes that have to do with what you find stressful, not in the detail, but, and then the other part is how big a reaction you have to stress. And that also has genes that have been found to be associated with suicide. But again, genetics is not destiny, because if you know you're like that, you can learn techniques to deal with stress in a less toxic way, so that you're taking care of your brain, your body, your relationships. So just because it does run in families about twice as often in if you have suicide in your close relatives, so twice as often for something that's relatively unusual, doesn't mean you're at high risk, but it contributes in part along with other factors.
Just something to be aware of.
Yeah, and learn about what happened with your family members, so that if you start experiencing that, you can intervene quickly. But also, it doesn't mean that you're going to end up dying by suicide by any means.
Great. Here's a practical question. How do you support someone who has suicidal ideation, but they have low motivation to attend therapy or improve their circumstances?
You know, you were going to say?
I was just going to say, as someone who, my mom died by suicide, and I watched her struggle for such a long time. So I know, looking back at it now, even when it felt like she wasn't doing much, it seemed that way. She was actually being a real warrior, just getting through those days.
Right.
And that's often what, that's the best someone can do. And that's enough. That's them being really strong, actually, even if it doesn't look like that. But yeah, is there anything like a concerned family member or friend can do if they can tell that someone really needs some professional support and that person doesn't seem motivated to go out and get that?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question, because like anything else, like your health and dieting and eating well and sleeping well, we all know we should eat well and get rest and stay hydrated, but we're not all that great at doing it. So I think, first of all, to understand what that person may be experiencing. So for instance, let's say they're experiencing depression. Depression is hard. It decreases your motivation. It decreases your attention. It decreases your capacity to do things. So I first want to reframe it to say it's not necessarily that they don't want to do anything, but in a way they can't do anything. So if you're worried about someone, start with a conversation. You can go with them. You can offer to help them negotiate finding a mental health professional. You can just find out what their resistance is and see if you can address it. It doesn't always work. And then you have to take care of yourself. Always be there. I'm here if you want to talk about it. As you know, I think that you would feel better with therapy anytime you're ready, or medication or whatever it is. I'm here. I'll help you. But I can't make you do it. And that's the bottom line, is you can't make somebody take care of themselves. And when it comes to mental health, it's harder because the way they're thinking about things is difficult. So I wish I could say we could always get somebody into care, but we know that's true for all health conditions. One thing I would suggest not to do is argue with them about it, because that puts them in a position of having to prove to you that they don't need it. And that's not where we to know that we hope that they will do it. We think it will help and we will help them, but they're in charge. Even when they don't feel in charge, even when they're not thinking properly, they're in charge. Now, obviously, if somebody is in immediate danger, then you can take action. Call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, go to the emergency room. But short of that, you really can't force somebody. You can go with them. You can go to therapy to find out how to deal with the fact that your loved one or your friend won't go and you're watching them suffer. But it's not 100%.
That's such a great point.
I often tell family members, you being in therapy could be very helpful to you, because it's hard when you have a family member who's not well with anything. And also you're modeling it then for them, and you can speak firsthand, because sometimes we have resistances that we don't realize. And we need to address those and model what we hope for somebody.
Exactly. What about, here's something that's more sort of chemically focused, I guess. What about going cold turkey off of anti-anxiety or sleep medications? Can that lead the brain towards suicidal thoughts or actions, just going cold turkey off a medication?
It's never, unless your doctor tells you, it's generally not helpful to stop anything cold turkey, but especially medications. Medications are, your brain is filled with all different neurotransmitters and hormones, and these are things that tell you, make us all function and have thoughts and feelings and behaviors. When you're taking medication, it's usually because the balance is off. It's not too hard to have the balance off. We've all experienced that sometime. And so you're taking a medication to rebalance your brain so that it's functioning optimally. Just like I would give a car analogy, but I know nothing about cars. But I know that in the olden days, you used to tune them up, So that's what medication does. And that's why often people with mental health conditions need to take more than one medication, because each medication works in a different way. So we're trying to mimic or imitate how the brain would normally be and have it be as balanced as possible. So now imagine that you suddenly stop one of those transmitters. That's going to throw your brain off balance. And there's often consequences, negative consequences to doing that. It doesn't mean you can't get off it, but you want to do that slowly and preferably with your clinician guiding you, because they know how much you can decrease it every day or every week so that you don't experience serious adverse consequences.
Here's a question that I think is really interesting. I've never gotten this question before. Is there a correlation between suicide and religious beliefs?
So that's there's religion and there's spirituality, and people have looked at both. And like everything else, this is how it works. It looks like when you are feeling pretty well, religion can help a person at risk, or spirituality, to not go down a path towards suicide, even if they're at risk. But in a way, the way I think about it is that there's a threshold. And once a person is at a certain point, that spirituality and religion are harder to access. And so they can't serve that function anymore. And so if you're going to, you need to address your mental health and suicide risk early, before you get to the point where you forget that those things help you to keep going and moving forward. And they also provide support and new ways to think about things. But when the brain is changing so you're feeling desperate and as if nothing is going to change, and the only way to end the pain is to kill yourself, sometimes the protective role of religion and spirituality gets lost.
That's interesting. So I would also think that for someone who is often that's accompanied by sort of there's a community of people. If you are, someone who goes to church or synagogue or whatever it is, connection is so important with suicide prevention, right?
Yeah, so connection is when I went to a research meeting, our research meeting, in fact, the International Summit for Suicide Research, I noticed that it's connection. It's not being with people that matters. It's connecting with people. And sometimes what happens when somebody is in that more suicidal state is they have what I coined this myself. It may not make sense to you, but they have what I call disconnection, DYS connections, like dysfunctional connection.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can be with people. Sometimes you don't even know what's going on, and in their mind, they're about to, take their life. So this is sometimes how a suicidal person might think. I love my family, and my family loves me, and I'm a burden, and they'll be better off without me. If we, in our non-suicidal state, think about that, that doesn't make sense. If you love someone and they love you, they're not going to be better off without you. And also, by the way, if you are a burden for a while, we're all burdened sometimes, that doesn't mean your family wants you dead. So either way you look at it, the end result is not that your family wants you gone, but that disconnection, like being connected with your family, but also being disconnected and not understanding the impact that your death might have. They might want you to be better. They might want you to be less something, agitated, depressed, kinder. They may want you to change, but that doesn't mean that they want you to kill yourself. So that's that disconnection. And if you see that slipping, talk to somebody, get some help.
What about this? How much? This is these are all interesting questions. How much higher are suicide rates for sexual assault survivors and people with, maybe a history of childhood abuse or neglect?
So we can look at it by studying people who have suicidal behavior or die by suicide, and we know that the rates are higher in those groups of people. What we don't know is, of all the people who have had this abuse or childhood adverse experiences, how many of them end up thinking about suicide or dying by suicide. So, but we do know that the rates are high, and typically higher than the general population, for child abuse and neglect. People forget about neglect. And also early childhood trauma. The rates are higher, but there are plenty of people who end up taking their lives who didn't have any. So it's not like you can just say, oh, they didn't have any trauma, so they're okay, because that's the complexity of suicide. But yeah.
I was just going to ask you, is there anything we can do about that? Whether we're the person ourselves who have that history, or if you care about someone who has that history, what can the average person do to help?
So there are trauma-focused therapies that help people to deal with the trauma. You can't take away the trauma. The trauma happened. It's just like if you lose someone to suicide, you can't change that. But you can find a place for it in your life so that it's not impacting everything that you do and not leading you down negative pathways. So the trauma-focused therapy, first of all, has to acknowledge and understand the trauma, and then understand how it's affecting you in the present, and then process it to in a way get it, to understand that you had that and it's not okay. So for kids, it's not okay for a child to have been abused physically, emotionally, sexually. It's just not okay. It's never going to be okay. So the goal of therapy is not to make it okay. The goal is to acknowledge that it happened and then find a place for it so that much of your life, it's going to crop its head up sometimes, but so that it's not running your life, that you can get the joy and celebratory experiences that happened in life as well. So if you know someone has had trauma, or if you know that there's abuse going on, you need to talk to them, but also get them out of that situation. And because it needs to stop. You can do that by calling, let's say, elder abuse or child protective services, or I've had that experience myself of doing that with friends of my kids who were in families where they were being abused. And it immediately changed the dynamic. Calling child protective services is not a punishment. It's actually extremely helpful, because they can help family members get into counseling. They can help them learn new behaviors. And that's what they do if something is founded. It's only they don't want to take the child out of the home unless they absolutely have to, because that's the child's family. So call protective services, talk to a guidance counselor in the school, talk to parents of kids, but sometimes parents are the problem. You need to talk to a safe adult about what's going on if you know a child is getting traumatized.
Well, you mentioned specific treatments, and someone else asks, and I'm going to broaden it out a little bit. They ask, how are treatments improving? But I'm also curious. I think research has shown that there are certain treatments, certain kinds of therapies that have been helpful with suicide prevention. Is that true? And what are they?
Yeah, that's true. And it helps to know sort of the pathway that somebody has taken to that, whether they're on the more dysregulated side, so that they're very emotional, they have unstable relationships, that kind of pathway, or the pathway of very deep depression and gray colored glasses, the world just looks terrible to them. Or they have psychosis and they have delusions and they're hearing voices and things like that. So you need to understand what's going on with the person. And then there's treatments that help the underlying problem. But for suicide, we also need to address the suicidal ideation and behavior and know what the person's warning signs are when they're heading down that path, and understand what their personal risk factors are, and then have a plan. So one thing is something called a safety plan, but have a plan of action, whether you're using a safety plan or CAMS, which is Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicide, or a crisis response plan. The point is that you have a plan of what you're going to do at different phases of a crisis. In the middle of a crisis is not a good time to start thinking about what you can do to feel better. Right? So these crisis plans and these safety plans help you understand, when are you going down that pathway? What are some things you can do early on, like to distract yourself, either by yourself or with other people? And by the way, breathing should be on everybody's list, whether you have a safety plan or not. It's highly portable. We all do it. And just something as simple as 3 breaths, taking 4 seconds to inhale, holding it for 4 seconds, and then letting it out for 4 or 5 seconds. Anything that's going to slow down and turn down the volume on a crisis. Then the next part of the plan is, who are people you can talk to about what's going on in your network, friends, family, the guy at the corner bodega, whoever it is that you talk to that you feel you could say, I'm not doing great, I need to talk to someone. And then there are the professionals, like your therapist, your primary care clinician, and also the emergency numbers. And then there are 2 other parts. One is, how do you limit access to lethal means? If you have a lethal means, best is to get it out of the house. If you can't get it, and that's true if you're worried about somebody in your house as well, and it's not you're worried about, get it out of the house. If you can't do that, lock it up safely. And then the last thing is, what's keeping you going? And sometimes when somebody's in that suicidal state, it's a lot of work for them to figure that out. And if you can be patient with them, and safety plans are usually done with clinicians. We're funding a study to look at using peer specialists to help someone develop a safety plan. But what's keeping you going? What are you looking for? It could be something that's going to happen next month, or it could be some lifelong change. But having a plan, rather than just letting your suicidal ideation run the gamut makes a big difference. So these suicide-specific treatments help people manage not just their thoughts and behaviors in life, but also their suicidal thoughts and behaviors.
That's great. Another person writes in, I'm currently going through PTSD therapy. I know trauma causes your brain damage, but can you reverse it?
Yes, the brain is very flexible. You can't always change 100% of whatever you've experienced, but the brain is very flexible. When I was a kid, we learned, you got a nerve cell. If you lose it, that's it. But it turns out that's not true at all. But I would like to reframe that from reversing it to reconfiguring it. You may not go back to exactly where you were, but your brain can make changes so that it gets back to functioning better. It may be in a different way, but you can find strategies and your brain can change.
That's interesting. That's also hope. I find that a lot of the stuff we know from research, I have personally found really hopeful, sort of surprisingly hopeful a lot of the time.
Oh yeah, we funded a really cool study where they took brain images of people's brains before and after dialectical behavior therapy, and which is a treatment specific for people who have emotion dysregulation and often suicidal behavior. And what they found was that some people got much more out of it than other people, and that those were the people who were, the front of their brain was not functioning as well as it could. And they got a lot more out of it. And then their brain functioning improved. The people who didn't have that problem in their brain to begin with eventually benefited from the therapy, but it clearly had a different pathway. So we're going to learn more about how to match a person with their treatment. It's the same thing with medications. One person does great on one medication, another person does great on another. Right now, we don't have, there are some tests coming out, but they have limited validity about how do you know how to match a person with the right medication and therapy. So we're going to get there through research. We work with research organizations all the time to help encourage research in these areas. But there's a lot of hope because we went from knowing very little to nothing to actually having treatments. And those treatments are working because they relate to what we understand the brain to be doing in someone who's at risk for suicide.
That's great to know. Well, so here's another one. We're talking a little bit about chronic pain or physical illness. One person writes in, why are people with a chronic physical illness more likely to die from suicide? Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah. So chronic pain does a lot of things. And so one is there's usually an underlying condition that's causing the pain that may relate to your, not just your body functioning, but your brain as part of your body functioning. So that could increase the risk. I remember talking with someone about a pain syndrome and saying to them, that your brain is part of your body, and if you have pain syndrome, you can still get depressed. It doesn't mean it's all in your head. Pain is depressing, and if you're at risk for depression, you can get depressed. So it can increase the possibility of you having depression or anxiety or other mental health conditions. But think about it. When you have chronic pain, you first of all have medicines. Medicines have an impact on your mood and your behavior. You're more limited most of the time, so you start to lose access to your social supports. If you're not careful, your self-esteem could go down, and the things you do typically to help yourself feel better, if you're not careful when you have pain, you might forget to do those things, and those things might have to change because you may not be able to do what you used to be able to do. You have limited function. Your work may change, so your whole life changes. That's a huge stress. That changes your whole life, socially, environmentally, in terms of brain function. So all those factors can come together in a person who's already at risk for suicide to increase the risk for suicide.
Here's one that kind of brings it back to our advocacy efforts. And I think this is an important one too. So one person writes in, their advocacy efforts for better education for general practitioners and emergency room healthcare workers to recognize a suicide risk and create a follow-up plan for that patient. So in other words, I think the kind of thing where you're in the ER or you just have a normal doctor visit and unexpectedly they ask you, how your mental health is or if you're having suicidal thoughts. Can you share what research has shown as the benefits of this type of patient-first mental health care system?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, it comes down to 83% of people will go to their primary care clinician at least once a year. So that's a touch point, right? That's a point to say, how are you doing? How's your mental health? How's your social life going? And if it's not going well, have you thought about taking your life and what have you thought? And you start that conversation. And that primary care setting could be equipped in advance with assessment tools, referrals, training as to what to do if someone says yes. So 83% of people go to their primary care clinicians. That's a touch point. 39% of people who die by suicide were seen in an emergency department within months of their death. So the emergency department becomes another touch point. And they may not have been seen for mental health concerns. They may have been seen because of an injury or a physical health concern. We just talked about how physical health can affect your mental health. And so by asking everyone if we can get to that point, and we're advocating for that, you won't suddenly have a huge number of people who are thinking of killing themselves, but you will, the data shows you'll find about twice as many people, but it's still only about 5% of people. And that's a point of intervention. And something as simple as giving a referral and then calling shortly thereafter and saying, have you followed up on that referral? And calling again a month later and calling again 3 months later. That actually, those repeated contacts after an emergency visit have been shown to save lives in terms of suicide. So these places are places where somebody might be identified and be comfortable enough to have a conversation. And by the way, 45% of people who die by suicide were seen by their primary care clinician just in the couple of months before their death. So these are touch points where we can train people up so they can actually do something helpful and intervene so that a person doesn't keep going down that pathway. And it's happening. It's starting to happen where people are asking. And when these health sites know what to do, it's making a difference. And there's something called zero suicide. And there are some studies that show when health centers take action to identify and then intervene with people who may be thinking about suicide or may have other risk factors, they actually reduce the rate of suicide in their clientele.
That just makes me think of the whole thing of it seems so simple that it wouldn't work, but it really is. Just asking someone directly is often all it takes for someone to say, yeah, I'm really having a tough time right now. And that's what connects them to help. And whether it's, that could be just a caring conversation between friends, or it could be a doctor, their general practitioner asking them.
You don't start off with, are you thinking of killing yourself? You first gather information to see if that's something and you also are building trust in that conversation. What surprises me, and I'm really happy about it, is that most people will tell you. We funded somebody to look at people who said no to a question about being thinking of killing themselves, and then shortly after they did make an attempt. Well, first of all, it took a long time for this person to find 30 people where that had happened, because most people had indicated on the questionnaires that when they were thinking about it, it was actually quite unusual for somebody to say no. But what she found was that about a third of people said no because they weren't thinking about it in that moment. Suicidal ideation comes and goes. And about a third were worried about what was going to happen if they said something. We need to change the culture from, if you say you're thinking about suicide, we're going to hospitalize you. We have a lot of things now that we can do to help people. And so we have to let clinicians know what to do, and people know that if you talk about it, you're going to have a conversation, and you'll have a say in that conversation about what happens next. There are extreme times where somebody is not in control and is at risk, and then that's a time for extreme measures. But most people feel better and can find other solutions for dealing with what's going on. And again, like in the crisis services, they really help to reduce risk. They really help to de-escalate. So most people will tell you, if you're worried about someone and they're not telling you, have a conversation. We also have that great Seize the Awkward, seizetheawkward.org platform that also teaches young people, but I like it, I learned from it, how to have conversations, and giving all kinds of tips. It's actually not that hard to say, hey, how are you? What's going on? And when they say, I'm nothing, you can let that go and say, okay, but no, I'm here for you. Or you could just say, well, I noticed that you've been a little grumpy lately and you're not showing up for the parties, so it makes me wonder what's going on. I'm here. You can talk to me.
Yeah, and maybe that's something we can link to also. seizetheawkward.org, which is for young people and teens. It really is very cool. There are a lot of videos from very popular social media influencers and musicians and people like that. I love that website. And the other thing this is all making me think of, particularly in terms of healthcare settings and emergency rooms, is AFSP's Project 2025, which maybe we can link to that also.
Yeah.
Which one of the big areas about, it's our initiative to reduce the suicide rate 20% by the year 2025. And one of the things is, a lot of it is about healthcare settings and then ERs. So
and that came out of research, by the way, how we could reach the most people.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's so interesting in terms of how that whole plan and strategy was arrived at. It was really thanks to research.
Yeah. I want to say that because I have tremendous empathy when a family, and I've had this experience, I know what it's like to have family members who are just not well. And it's very scary, and you do what you can. And I want to make sure that if you've lost someone to suicide, that you understand that we not at the point of being able to save every life. And ultimately it's that person, and you do what you can do. Because a lot of times when people lose someone to suicide, they have feelings of guilt, like I should have done this or I should have done that. And I've come to learn in my clinical work, working with people, that that's really a wish that you could have done something. And when I should have taken their call. Well, you didn't know, or whatever. It's a wish that you could have done something. And ultimately, it is up to the person in that moment, and their thinking is off, and they may do things that they don't even really understand the implications. They may not even know they were going to do it. So how could you know that you were going to do it? So if you know somebody who lost someone to suicide, I just let them talk about it and understand that that's such a difficult thing. And that while they think that they could have, should have, would have, it's probably not likely. And learning that is a really important part of healing.
And speaking of healing, I just want to point out there, for anyone who has lost someone to suicide or knows someone who's lost someone, there are programs and there are resources for that kind of support. You deserve that kind of support. So if you go to afsp.org, and I'm giving a lot of links that we can link to, but we have a wonderful loss and healing program. There's a wonderful thing called the Healing Conversations program, for instance. Where
we also sorry.
No, go on.
I'm worried about time here. We also have a program for people who are living with someone who's made a suicide attempt. It's called Finding Hope, and we have some materials for that as well. So I'm sorry to cut you off, but I just want to get that in there.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up. And There's one question I know we just have 2 or 3 minutes left. One I want to get to specifically on the topic of research. If suicide attempt survivors are interested in contributing to research, one person writes in, how can they find studies or ways to contribute?
That's a great question. We actually have a section on our website called Participate in Research. And so if there are national studies that are being done, people will often, it's not really an advertisement, we post it. But if you live near a hospital or a university or a clinical research center, you can just contact them and let them know that you're interested in participating. And we're working really hard to make sure that research includes people who have had experience with suicidal behavior. Again, the myth that they're just people aren't on the verge of dying just because they've engaged in suicidal behavior. And so we're really working hard to get researchers to look more deeply into and include people who made suicide attempts in their research, and how to do that in the most respectful and helpful way.
Yeah, and that for anyone, I want to say as we head off into the sunset from this episode, there's lots of great stuff on our website. There are lots of, for anyone who's interested in suicide prevention research, you can find that pretty easily. And there are tons of very short, digestible videos that we have. I forget, what is the link for that? It's something...
afsp.org/learning more. I call it the video Wikipedia of suicide research. And they just, if you have a question, like there's some about genetics, there's some about advocating, there's some about survivors. There's a really cool one about the brain and how the importance of how to manage stress with your, they're just, okay, they're very cool. But we have a lot of information. And I want to say, if your local chapter, because we have chapters in all 50 states and Puerto Rico, can host a research connection program where an AFSP researcher talks with the community about what they were studying and what they found. And it's very easy to host. So if you're connected with your chapter, or if you're not, please do. There's so many good things happening. But you can bring a research connection program to your community.
Yeah, and the local chapters, again, you can just type your zip code into our website and find your local chapter. And that's a great inroad for learning all kinds of things that are going on in your community and connecting with other people who just kind of get it, who have some connection to this. You don't have to, I think people who have some connection to suicide, we don't talk about it. We often feel like we need to over-explain. And in fact, we just don't talk about it enough in general in our culture. That's changing a little bit, but the local chapters will tell you all about wonderful education programs and loss support and all kinds of wonderful things.
Yeah, and we're sounding like groupies, but I just want to say I was an AFSP groupie before I started working here. I got my first research grant from AFSP in 1992, and that was it. I've been connected ever since, even though I didn't start working here until 2011. So it's just an incredible community of people. And also become an advocate. Go to our advocacy center. It's very easy and it makes a difference. We got the 3-digit number because AFSP volunteers, myself included, wrote to our legislators about the importance, and they listened to us. So we have the advocacy forum coming up June 7th. It'll be live streamed if you want. Just, so much to do to save lives and bring hope.
And yeah, signing up as a volunteer advocate, it can be as simple as they just send you emails, and again, you put your zip code in and it tells you when there's legislation and you can literally just click a button to send a note to your representatives. And it takes like 2 minutes or something, maybe, once you're signed up. And again, moreformentalhealth.org will let you really do it kind of a deep dive into what kind of things we're advocating for, and anyone can get involved from just like clicking on an email and sending it to, our advocacy forum. There are meetings set up and state capitol days where you can meet your representatives and tell them that this kind of stuff is important to you.
We're on a mission, and fortunately, there's a lot of people who are joining us on that mission. I know we can't answer all the questions. I wish I could just stay on and answer everybody's questions and have conversations, but I'm guessing that that's not possible.
Yeah, I mean, just in taking a glance, there's so many people who wrote in. And so I just want to say thank you for your wonderful questions today. Thank you for taking the time with us. Speaking of, I thought a fun way to end the conversation, Jill, you mentioned being AFSP groupies. Can you share, someone lovingly made a little doll of, of our beloved Dr. Jill that you just shared with me before we started.
At home. In the
it's
middle
uncanny.
Of COVID. This is Ann Morrison, our area director on Long Island, saw a nutcracker. Okay, we're not going to discuss that. That reminded her of me, and she developed this. Is a voice, be the voice. This is Dr. Jill, research rock star in our research programs. So it's really dear to my heart, and I keep it nearby all the time. So that's my groupie thing.
I think that little moment, I think that's a great way to end our episode. And I just want to say, we think of suicide as being a depressing topic. I think it's a serious topic, but it doesn't always have to be depressing to talk about. There's so much hopeful stuff, and a lot of it comes from the research and learning more and supporting that. So Jill, thank you so much for spending your time with me and our audience. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today, and to the mighty.
And
thanks for watching.
Thank you, Brett.
My pleasure. Same here. Back at you. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.